Flint Sparks is a Zen teacher and psychologist dedicated to assisting people in the unending path of growing up and waking up. His academic training includes graduate degrees in both biology and psychology. He has extensive postdoc training in mindfulness-based psychotherapy and group therapy with specialty training in both the Hakomi method and internal family systems model. Not only is he an experienced therapist and a master teacher whose work assists people in the skillful removal of blocks to love, he acts as a clear and caring resource on the path of freedom from unnecessary suffering. His traditional Zen training began at the San Francisco Zen Center and continued at the Austin Zen Center, which he founded and nourished in its early years. He is currently a resident teacher at Appamada, a center for Zen practice and inquiry in Austin, Texas. Today, his teaching and consulting bridges the fields of health psychology, the psychology of contemplative practices, and traditional Zen Buddhist practice. In the tumult of our daily lives, with uncertainty in so many arenas around us, it is crucial not to withdraw into a cocoon of self-protection. It's more important than ever to learn what it means to grow up and wake up into our full potential as human beings. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Flint Sparks.
Thank you. I'd like to thank you as well for braving the elements, although right now it's quite beautiful. It's a great honor and pleasure to be here tonight. And thank you, Miriam and Catherine, for your introduction. I was leading a retreat, a meditation retreat, in the UK about 10 days ago. We were in the Lake District. And in that early spring time in the Lake District, it was very beautiful, but rainy. And one afternoon, I took a walk right before the retreat, trying to kind of get very focused and clear. And the winds and the rains that had come off the Irish Sea through the mountains and over the lakes had begun to die down, and the sun began to come out. And I had already spoken to Catherine about arranging tonight's talk. And you know, you're always looking for inspiration, the one thing that will help you know exactly how to begin and where to go to deliver the message that you find most important. And so that afternoon, I stopped in the sunlight that came through from the early morning clouds, just like today. And this is what I saw. And then I knew where to begin. And because 3 questions came to me, questions that I thought would guide our discoveries and our search tonight for what it means to grow up and wake up. And the questions that came to me standing on that little rocky road watching the new spring lambs in the Lake District was first, I thought, what is consciousness aside from experience? There are ways in which we can study consciousness technically. We can speak about it abstractly, and we can understand some amazing things, but really it comes down to our personal experience. How does this human consciousness unfold? And what is a mind, if we're going to study the mind, without a body? That really, in some ways, the mind is this whole organism, of course. And your speakers that you have in the series do a wonderful job of helping you understand the complexity and the beauty of how we come to be what we are as human beings. And so I was thinking in that afternoon, we need to talk about experience, we need to talk about embodied experience, and then the real question came. You have to wait for the one to rise to the top. The real question was, what is a life without love? We can spend a lot of time in the laboratory. We can understand consciousness. We can understand the mind and how it develops and how it works. But what about this, this word that is almost taboo for a scientist? You know, I spent a lot of time training as a scientist. And we didn't really talk about the mind, much less love. But this is really the question that's at the heart of things. What would a life be without love? What is it that motivates us to do most of the things we do? What are the things that shape the personality that we have? Most of it is about maintaining, wishing for, sustaining, being fearful of losing love. And so I hope that you'll allow us tonight to spend some time speaking about something that is outside of the laboratory. We're going to step outside of the lab tonight. We're going to speak about things that, of course, we learn in the laboratory, but we're going to step much further afield from it and see what we can learn. This opens the possibility of going deeply into both psychological teachings and skillful means of transformation, and also spiritual. This image that you see now is, of course, of Kuan Yin, which is an image that comes from Buddhism. And this is an image of healing compassion. And I love this one particularly because it's holding up this vessel as if there's something that it's offering. Or is it? If someone were to come to you and hold this and with this gesture, what does the gesture mean? Am I offering you something or am I receiving something? It can be either, right? I spent a lot of time in the laboratory. My doctoral program that I was in at Johns Hopkins was in cell molecular biology. I was fascinated about how things became what they are in developmental biology. The specific research I was doing in the laboratory was on the nucleohistone protein complexes that folded up DNA to make a chromosome. How did this thing fold up and then unfold and release its information? And I was really fascinated, but I made a tremendous discovery in the laboratory that I was ill-prepared to discover. I discovered that I absolutely love studying science, and I didn't really like doing it. So 2 years into a wonderful program with a full scholarship and a complete ride from NIH, I resigned. Which is not an easy thing to do. But I could tell that my heart was drawn and my personhood, my skills, were really in a different kind of laboratory, the laboratory of the phenomenology of human relationship. So I was still interested in how things became what they were, how things would fold up and unfold and release information, but it was more in the venue of human relationships. And so I switched fields and got degrees in psychology to go with the biology degrees, and that's how I ended up in behavioral medicine. Specifically, I started working in cancer care. And I'm telling you this story because in working with cancer patients, I worked for many, many years full-time with people who are dying. So I'm a PhD clinical psychologist. I've never spent one day of my life in a psychiatric hospital, but I've spent years in medical surgical floors. And in the process of working with people who were facing life and death, there were questions that they were asking me that I couldn't answer psychologically. The psychological work I did with them was very useful in healing. But they were asking questions that had to do with the soul, as it were. Not specifically religious, but something that was, so I went looking further. And since I didn't want to offer something particularly religious, but I wanted to touch the spiritual question that people had, and I'd been trained in medical hypnosis. biofeedback, visualization. I worked with Carl and Stephanie Simonton, who were lecturers in the Mind Science Foundation in the past, and working with cancer patients. And so I began to look to the East because meditation was a central practice. And when I began to study Buddhism, I realized I'd found my place, because the Buddha had only one question. How do we create suffering and how can we end it? And I was in the suffering business. And so I knew that this was a spiritual path, or at least something that would inform what I was doing. I trained as a psychotherapist and also as a student of Buddhism, and then later as a Zen Buddhist priest, became a teacher. And I began to realize two really important things that launch our story. Number one, as a psychotherapist, I noticed that there are people who had amazing insight, tremendous psychological awareness. They understood a lot of what went on inside of them, and they could make big changes in their lives. And many of them were stuck in self-reflection and self-identification and no way to get out of it. Do you understand what I mean? They could see themselves, think about themselves, understand themselves, but without a non-dual practice of the mind, they were always locked in self. Now, also, I've spent years in Buddhist temples and monasteries training, and I found some of my colleagues and teachers had amazing clarity. They understood the Dharma, or the Buddhist teachings. They could teach it, and yet when they sat on the meditation cushion, and pain from the trauma of their childhood, or discomfort with the person that they were sitting next to came up, they had no idea what to do with it. And just sitting more didn't seem to help. But what I began to find in this dual training is that if a person could utilize the tools of psychology and psychotherapy and utilize the practices that the Buddha taught, suddenly there was a capacity to touch both sides. And so that's what I call the double helix, since I was a biological scientist, of growing up and waking up. And in that double helix, the thing that holds together these two streams is actual love. So one side of the helix is this issue of growing up. How can we become intimate with our lives and in the relationships around us and become full as a human being? We go from childhood, or infancy, into childhood, childhood into adolescence, then to adulthood, and from a psychological point of view, that's usually where it ends. You're a grown-up. Except that's not actually where it ends. There's more to the story of growing up. And that more to the story has something to do with what it means to wake up. What does it mean to wake up? In a way, it means to continue the arc of human development without ever stopping. That there's actually no end to that process. And how do we understand that no end, that is the full development of human consciousness and what it has to offer? And if we're going to follow a path, a set of practices that's going to help us, then what is the everyday path? What is the path that you and I can actually take? Not something that we have to research in the laboratory. What's something that's available to you? And what's available to us as shaky, vulnerable human beings? Because this is where it matters, right? This is the other part. If we're going to talk about the word that we're not supposed to talk about, which is love tonight, we also have to talk about vulnerability. That's one of the great ways in which we're held, supported, and encouraged as human beings when we're cared for. And so what is the path of a shaky, vulnerable human being, which means us? Is there someone that doesn't fit that category, by the way, here? If you don't, you can leave. Because the rest of this won't make any sense to you. It won't matter. But if you're an ordinary, vulnerable, shaky human being at times, and you're interested in the expression of your full potential, then there is a path that is available to you that the research in mind really supports. And there's a story we can go back to the beginning of the story. In northern India, when Siddhartha Gautama was a young renunciate, he'd left the palace that he lived in. Many of you know this story. He was a prince. But he wasn't convinced that he understood what life was about. He snuck out of the palace in which he was very well protected, and he saw someone who's ill, someone who's old, someone who's died, and he wanted to understand this thing that he'd never seen before. And he studied with everyone he could, all the teachers of his day, and he mastered apparently all the techniques. They said he was kind of a spiritual genius, but it didn't answer his question about why do we suffer and what can we do about it. And using the sort of ascetic, self-renunciate kind of pathways that were available to him at the time, he lay down on the side of a stream one day, not this one's in northern England. But it's a nice image to go with the story. Nearly dead, certainly exhausted from the kind of practices, the self-denying practices. And there was a young woman, Sujata, walking along the path going to a temple, and she had an offering. Sweet cream and rice that she was going to take to the temple, a Hindu temple. And she saw this fellow by the side of the stream that looked ill, in need, emaciated. And instead of going to the temple, she went to him and she said, "Please eat this. It'll help you. You look like you're in trouble." If it was happening down here on the Riverwalk, we're like, "Dude, you look bad. You know, you need something." And he decided at that moment to take some nourishment. In fact, it says he understood the middle way. One of the stories indicates that as a boat went down the river, someone was playing a tune that was very beautiful. And he thought, oh, if the strings are too loose, there's no music. But if they're too tight, they break. What's the middle way? And so he took food, he was nourished, and began to focus himself on the meditation that ultimately led to his awakening. So really, the start of the whole Buddhist path did not begin with philosophy, or she did not implore him with some theological discourse. It was basically just simple human kindness. The entire transformation of this one person, and in some ways of our world, started with this one act of just human kindness and generosity. Arnold Toynbee was asked at the end of the 19th century, what do you think is going to be one of the biggest things in the 20th century that will shape history? And he said, the introduction of Buddhism to the West. That there's something about understanding this kind of path that's very, very powerful. What the Buddha did when she was kind is he sat down under a tree and he sat in silence and stillness, and he began to be a researcher. But he was a researcher in a way that sometimes we don't think of as research. What does a researcher do? Has a question, engages in some sort of investigation with some sort of tool, gathers data, and then checks that data with other people who've used those tools or those methods to see if they match. Fair enough? Okay. So if you're a scientist like he was, the tool that you use is meditation. You know, if you're an astronomer, you use a tool called a telescope. You can see things, you can get data, you can match with what other people get. If you're a heart specialist, you need to use the tools of an electrocardiogram, get information. But if you're a mystic and you want to do research, you have to learn how to meditate. And you do get data, and you can check it with other people who have done those things. So the place he looked was into actually the life that he had. And this is what's important. Every single one of you sitting in this room today has all of the necessary ingredients for awakening. You have a body, a mind, you have the weight of your own conditioning and history, all the things that a life has. And that's what he looked into, and by looking deeply into his own life, not to the heavens, not to theology, not to something esoteric, into his own life, he was able to begin to wake up. And he learned 3 super important things that completely changed the way that he began to teach. In fact, the first one is everything changes. The teachings on impermanence. Nothing stays the same. Everything is contingent, which really means that everything is related to everything else. There's no such thing as a separate thing, because everything is related to everything else. These lovely pieces of paper on which the applications were done for the, we call this a piece of paper, right? Well, what's it really made of? What's that? Yeah, wood, trees. But who are the people who printed this? Who are the guys who brought the logs in? Who are the people at the paper mill or the store? And once you begin this whole process, it doesn't ever end, does it? Where is the end of this thing happen? And so this piece of paper is made from things that aren't paper, but we call it a paper. Like if you take one of these chairs, we call it a chair, but if you break the legs off, what do you have? You have a broken chair. Like, ooh, bad. But how bad do you have to break it down to where like the chairness isn't there anymore, and it's just stuff? It's interesting, isn't it? We have names for things that aren't the thing, because it's made up of everything. And this is a more difficult concept, but he understood that everything is related to everything else. There isn't any separate thing. It's all one big thing arising together. And he also realized something that if you don't understand the first 2 things, you really get a big dose of, and that is that discomfort is inevitable. If you're in a body, you get discomfort, right? And most of us that are over 30 know that it gets worse, right? Things change, things are related to everything else, and discomfort is inevitable. Not necessarily a huge amount of suffering, that's the optional part, but pain comes, change comes, and we can learn to deal with it. Out of these pieces of awareness, the contingency that everything is related is what was most important. And as a scientist, that's one of the things I was really interested in. How do we take this understanding and bring it into our lives and to bear on things that are really, really important, such as the lives of the cancer patients that I was treating? This image, this woodblock print from Hokusai, is a classic kind of woodblock print. What do you see when you look at it? What's happening? You see people, right? Is anyone alone? Isn't it interesting? Everybody's paired up. Now, some of them are burdened. They have something that they're carrying. Some of them are, the ones on the bridge, they're turning around and looking together. There are a couple of people seemingly helping each other enter the bridge. And there are the 2 down below fishing, moving in and out of the water. So in the beauty of this ancient woodblock print, there's a subtle message that everything that we're talking about is relational. In fact, relational in the way that I mentioned earlier, that the sheep were telling us about, in terms of care and love. But love is one of those words that's sort of like the things that we're talking about. It's just a concept. It doesn't really hold together if we're going to understand what this is really about. This is more about loving. How does one, in a reciprocal way, wake up and grow up? And it means we have to learn to know each other and to be known in friendship. And walking this path is something that we do together. And these are the ways that it begins to make sense to us. Human beings are curious and complex creatures, if you haven't noticed. You can say other things that don't seem as nice, but human beings are very curious and complex creatures. And there are two things that we have to understand to continue the path tonight, which is, number one, human beings, our nervous systems do not self-assemble. You know when you get those things from IKEA? You look at the instructions, it's like, what? Or you get a baby. So some assembly is required, and that assembly actually takes a good long while. Amazing, unbelievably fantastic things happen very quickly in the first few years, but it continues on. The other important thing is that our true nature, our Buddha nature, our Christ consciousness, whatever you want to call it, does not blossom on its own. So if our nervous systems don't come together all by themselves, and our true nature doesn't come forward all by itself, we're looking at this relational, loving, caring thing that we better pay attention to. And the core of it has to do with, we're going to look at some evidence from interpersonal neurobiology and psychotherapy to understand the coalescing of our nervous system. And we're going to look at mindfulness and contemplative practices to understand how our true nature comes forward. But here's the secret. We're moving from dial-up to Wi-Fi. Here's what I mean. How many of you have a belly button? Everybody, right? Okay, I hope. What that means is that at one point you had dial-up. You were plugged in. Right? I mean, really. And you know, for those of you that have used these things, when you have the Ethernet cord, you know, it's very stable, it's pretty fast, but it tethers you. Once a child is born, you lose your connection, but not completely. Now that life-giving, sustaining, nourishing connection that we all have to have is only going to be sustained if we can have some new connection. And that connection is not going to come physiologically in the same way. So let's change the question. What is a life without love? What is a life without loving? Here's a statement from a fellow named Lewis in a book called A General Theory of Love. Because mammals need relatedness for their neurophysiology to coalesce correctly, most of what makes a socially functional human comes from connection, the shaping physiological force of love. When an infant is born, there is a natural capacity when that cord is cut to orient. And guess what? The mother has the same thing, and the father. And there are hormones that help this stuff, but there's a natural ingrained sense of orientation. Now that begins to develop more complexity over time. But for a human nervous system, the thing that the Mind Science Foundation is studying, to come to its full fruition, it's very important to understand how it actually begins. How we can move from this sense of physical connection to as if we're having Wi-Fi neurologically between us. And that is sustained by the basic limbic structures in the core of the brain. The more primitive part of the brain begins this simple shift to resonant Wi-Fi. And I call it resonant because there is a capacity for us to begin to resonate. This is what we look for when we connect. When we look, like, is someone seeing us? Do they recognize us? Do they care about us? Are they noticing us? Do we notice them? We seek this automatically. We don't even have to think about it. And when we do connect, it's sort of like when you have your cell phone and you're looking for the little bars. Oh, I've got a good signal. Well, you know when you have a good signal with another human, don't you? You can feel it. And what happens when you have that strong signal is your whole physiology begins to settle. And there is a kind of a physiological, which is neurological, regulation that happens through the connection. As a psychotherapist, there's also one other part that comes to play. When people are dysregulated and have had histories that make it very difficult for them to connect and to resonate because it's been problematic, a new relationship which offers a healthy, strong connection can also help that nervous system revise itself. So these three functions of the limbic system are crucial for us to be able to orient, to connect, and to change our physiology if we're distressed, but if we're an infant, actually to create it. Human beings don't actually, see, there's one of those signals right now. You see? They're all over the place. In fact, the limbic structures are a little bit like your cell phones because imagine if you could measure how many cell phone conversations are going through this room right now. A lot. But why don't you know it? Why don't you pick them all up? You know, you don't have a receiver, right? At least in this, now. Who knows? They may figure it out. And then you can also do Facebook, right? Inside. Limbic structures are receivers. That's what helps us begin to orient. And orient to the most intimate, delicate things in our lives. So this is the practice of turning toward and orienting ourselves towards what's most crucial and most necessary for mammals, and that is to be connected. In the 13th century, there was a Zen master Dogen who was the founder of the school that I'm ordained in. He brought Chan, which Buddhist practice, to Japan, which became Zen. And he was asked one time, what is the mind of enlightenment? And he said, intimacy with all things. That the awake mind, the fully awake mind, is a capacity for deep intimacy, for connection. Not just intimacy like human intimacy, but to know each thing fully as it is. So limbic structures help us orient, they help us connect, and the practice of turning toward each moment instead of turning away in the ordinary ways that we do to protect ourselves are things that assist us in this intimacy. Because our minds seek one another through limbic resonance, because our physiological rhythms answer to the call of limbic regulation, and because we change one another's brains through limbic revision, what we do inside relationships matters more than any other aspect of human life. If you don't remember anything else from tonight, remember the last part of that quotation. Relationships matter. In fact, if you look back at the teachings that the Buddha was offering, those three things, he was saying that everything is connected in an odd kind of way. Relationships are all there is. But human relationships are the most powerful things that shape us. It's what orients us every day. It's what helps change our internal state for good or ill. And ultimately, it's what revises those places we're stuck or pained and where we long for care and connection. And there are another set of structures which help us in this regard, in the prefrontal cortex. To understand what all the prefrontal cortex does would be another lecture. But what I can say here is that this is the bridge that connects. This is the bridge. It connects the rest of the cortex with the limbic areas, also with the brainstem, and down into the body for the entire nervous system. The prefrontal cortex is one of the reasons we're different than the sheep. Those mammals want to be close and want to be cared for, but not in the way we do, not in the way that allows our communication in depth. The little lamb was standing on top of the mom. But it's a little different when a son is holding her mom, his mom, which this is my mother, watching the sunrise over the leper colony in Kalapapa and Molokai, watching the sun come up out of the Pacific. So the limbic structures help us learn the practice of turning toward present moment experience. Our prefrontal cortex helps us deepen this practice of intimacy. 300 years after Dogen, another Zen teacher was asked, what is the mind of enlightenment? And Zen Master Unman said, the mind of enlightenment is an appropriate response. How do we meet life appropriately? This comes about because limbic structures connect us. Prefrontal cortex integrates what we have. In other words, we now have a receiver for the signals, our Wi-Fi. Now we can make sense of it. And it supports the two crucial things for us in human development, which is secure attachment and interpersonal attunement. And attachment and attunement are the two fundamental things that allow us to become healthy and happy human beings. Breaks in secure attachment, difficulties in attunement, cause us distress. This is what it means to grow up, to be with others in a healthy, full way, and to work with what arises in these relationships. That's the hard one, right? That's where the things like couple therapy. And in some ways to come home, to take refuge in who we most truly are. But if to understand that, we have to go through one more brain structure, and that are the parietal lobes. The left parietal lobe helps us know where our body is in space. The right one situates the body in terms of the whole environment. Studies that have been done on Tibetan monks and also some Benedictine nuns who are doing deep meditation, they did some functional MRIs to ask them, do your contemplative practice or your meditation, tell me when you're in that state of oneness, where you're one with the environment, one with God, whatever your particular way of saying it is. And we're going to watch what happens physiologically. What happens is these part of the parietal lobes turn off. So the people literally don't understand where they are. There's no separation. This is what the parietal lobes do. The parietal lobes help us say, I am separate and independent. This is where I am. I'm here, not there. And our ancestor survival strategies were dependent on these things. Our nervous system helped us learn to create separations, to form boundaries between ourselves and the rest of the world. And also between one idea and another, one feeling and another. To maintain stability, to keep physical and mental systems in a healthy balance, and to approach opportunities and avoid threats. So, create separation, maintain stability, get what's good, reject what isn't. That's our biology. The Buddha's insight was, in terms of creating separation, guess what? Everything's connected. Maintaining stability, well, everything changes. And grab what you like and push away what you don't. No thing is ever ultimately satisfying. In fact, he said attachment and aversion are some of the problems that cause us pain. So what's reality? Which is it? Is it what the Buddha said, or how our brains are geared just through evolution? Well, we have to understand that we actually work with simulators in our brains. We make up reality. We make up virtual reality with these organs, and then we respond as if the virtual reality were the real thing. And that distance between what's happening and our perception of it is called suffering. That's where suffering arises, because we don't actually see things the way they are. As one Zen teacher called it, things as it is. It's an interesting grammatical error, isn't it? Things as it is. That everything is actually one thing. Things as they are. Things as it is. This is what we began to turn toward in practice. And the Buddha gave us 4 ways of understanding how to come to terms with this sort of misunderstanding. The first one was the nature of suffering. If we're caught in our self-centered dream, then we're going to suffer. The first noble truth was the truth of dukkha, that life as we live it is unsatisfactory. We don't like it. We don't want it to be the way it is. It's usually translated as life is suffering, which is, of course, not true. Life is much more than just suffering. It's more like life is everything that it is. But we don't like it that it's everything that it is. We want it to be our way, hence self-centered. And so we begin to suffer. And the more we hold to those self-centered thoughts, the more we stay in this dream. That's the simulator. We get caught in a loop. If we can become more intimate with each moment of our experience by turning toward it, as life as it is, then we can begin to learn more about reality. And being in each moment and understanding what's really going on helps us become compassionate, which is the capacity to turn towards suffering and not turn away. So this is a chant that we actually do in our meditation center each day. Caught in the self-centered dream, only suffering. Holding to self-centered thoughts, exactly the dream. Each moment, life as it is, the only teacher, and being just this moment is compassion's way. I sometimes say, if you need an idea for a tattoo, that's not a bad one, because you'll at least have some really good teachings that you can carry with you, which are the fundamental teachings of the Buddha. But these teachings go against the evolutionary template, the one that says, I'm separate, I want to make things stable, I only want the things I want, and I want to push away the things that I don't want. This goes against the evolutionary template to undo the cause of suffering, to feel one with all things, to flow with the changing moment, and to remain unmoved by pleasant and unpleasant alike. So how do you go against the flow? And mindfulness practices seem to be the things that are most powerful in shifting the direction of this evolutionary flow. Most traditionally, mindfulness is thought of as mirror thought. It reflects only what's happening in exactly the way it is happening. That's a very traditional definition of mindfulness, a capacity to notice what's happening with no extra, nothing added, just noting exactly what's happening. Another teacher says that according to the Buddha Dharma, or the teachings of the Buddha, spirituality means relating with the working basis of one existence, which is one's state of mind. The method for beginning to relate directly with the mind is the practice of mindfulness. I put this longer one in because the first one says mindfulness is mirror thought. It's just reflective, like a mirror, passive, just reflects. The mirror doesn't do anything. But this teacher is saying, not only is it reflective, but it's a way to begin to work with the mind. It's the way to begin to understand the way in which you cause yourself or others suffering. And mindfulness is the way that you begin to become intimate with it. And even more interesting, and sometimes more disturbing, sitting quietly and listening carefully to yourself, you can observe the main voice in which your thoughts recite themselves, which is a lovely way of saying when you sit down and get quiet, you realize your mind is crazy, right? It was when I sit in front of large audiences who are doing meditation, it's extremely inspiring because when I'm sitting here looking out at people who are silent for long periods of time and meditating, it looks like there's a sea of Buddhas. Everybody's very quiet and still and centered, and everybody settles very deeply. But I know it's a complete madhouse out there, because that's really what's going on, right? The ability to relate to all of that is what's important, not that all of that is going on. That's normal, that's human. So mindfulness has these qualities of being reflective. It is mirror thought, but it's not passive, it's engaged. Our mind reflects what's happening, but it is intimate with it. It's spacious and open, but very, very connected. And these are qualities that we don't often have in everyday life. You know, meditation asks us to put two things together that usually aren't linked. We're asked to be extremely relaxed and extremely alert all at the same time. Now, when you're driving on I-35 in the rain, you might be extremely alert, right? But not very relaxed. And if you go down on the Riverwalk and have a margarita, you can be pretty relaxed, but not very alert, right? But meditation asks us to do things. Drive while drinking. No, to be relaxed and alert at the same time. To be able to be quiet and settled and focused and very, very awake. And these qualities of mind make that possible. So what are the practices that help us? You know, practice turning toward things as they are, that orienting function of the limbic structures, and the willingness to turn towards what's happening helps us see things more clearly. If I'm paying attention and very careful attention, I can see the truth of what's happening much more clearly. In Buddhism, that's called wisdom. If I practice facing the difficulties in my life and others, and I don't turn away, if I don't use my habitual, automatic ways of dealing, if I'm willing to stay and face, then my heart opens. And in Buddhism, that's called compassion. So wisdom and compassion are the two fruits of this kind of practice, of turning toward and staying with. And those mindful practices open the process of waking up. So let's review for a second. Tell me if this looks like a good list to you. If someone was what we're calling a grown-up, very mature, healthy, happy human being, or if they're a Buddha, if they're an enlightened human being, this person more than likely would have a fairly regulated body, have the capacity not to be extreme in their reactivity to the world. They would probably have attuned communication, some skill in connecting and attuning with others, emotional balance, as opposed to being all over the map or disruptive to others, have the capacity to respond with some flexibility, not getting caught in your own, what do we call it, stuff. To modulate fear, which is one of the core ways in which we get dysregulated, right? We get frightened. Also, that this is happening with some moral awareness. You know, someone can be very attuned and attentive, and if they don't have moral awareness, what you have is a lethal human being. So it's very crucial, which means the person was probably also intuitive. They have a sense of that their body can give them information, not just their mental capacity. Their body gives them, the gut feeling about themselves. They have some insight, empathy with others. These are all functions that in the research on mindfulness unfold regularly through mindful practice. If you would like to have these in your life, if you'd like to have better body regulation, attuned communication, emotional balance all around, then mindful practices are what you can engage in to encourage those qualities to unfold. Interestingly enough, they're exactly the same qualities. They are the functions of the prefrontal cortex. So these two things begin to inform each other. Meditation practice encourages the integrative function of the prefrontal cortex, which is the one that supports growing up and waking up. The prefrontal cortex functions in these ways when it's functioning well and unhindered by pain, difficulty, distress, especially things like trauma or difficulty. So we're homing in on something that is crucial and essential, and that has to do with both our capacity to grow into our fullness as a human being and also wake up as whole human beings. What happens when you just look at it, at the photo? What does it call up inside of you? You know, your prefrontal cortex can be stimulated just by a photograph, because this is what we do. Human beings orient naturally to try to pick up these signals. We want to be relaxed, regulated, balanced, expressive, and receptive. We want to be able to walk together on the path. We want to be able to be connected. And all of that is just the complexity and fullness of human life. And what spiritual practices do is it allows us to become a larger and larger container for life energy. Life energy wants a channel to flow through. And if you'd like to become an open channel for that flow, then these are the practices that help us really come home to who we really are in this double helix of growing up and waking up. When we meet difficulty, remember what Sujata did with the Buddha? Offered him nourishment when he was in a difficult place, and the whole Dharma wheel began to turn by simple kindness. Later on, he was asked by one of his monks, the Buddha said, what should we do if we experience a difficult emotion? He says, gaze upon it with kindness and remain still. Engage in turning toward and meeting fully without messing with it too much. We're a great culture for messing with things. It sells a lot of self-help books, but it can be problematic. Someone who has that capacity, there's a name for it in Buddhism. It's called a Bodhisattva. A Bodhisattva is an archetypal image of a being who's dedicated to the well-being of all other beings. It's someone who says, I'm going to dedicate my life to helping other folks be free. In fact, the extreme definition that sometimes you see is that in the old way, if you're living a life until you're awakened and you can get off the cycle of birth and death, a bodhisattva says, you know what, I'm going to hang around until every last person has been freed from the cycle of birth and death, then I'll go. So it's just a sort of an extreme archetypal image of generosity, altruism, and care for others. There was a Zen teacher, Uchiyama Roshi, who died about 15 years ago. And he lived in Japan all of his life, but he taught a lot of Western students. So he learned to speak English a bit. And he was a wonderful guy. And so one day, one of his students asked him, what is a bodhisattva? It's one of those things that students do when they know perfectly well what the answer is, but they want to see what the teacher's going to say. You know, it's why you line up at the microphones, right? You kind of know what we're going to say, but you want to ask and to see what comes out. So one of the students asked Uchiyama one time, what is a bodhisattva? And he thought for a minute and he said, I think a grown-up. A grown-up. A mature human being. This is not some esoteric thing that you find only in some hidden valley in Tibet. It's not a way of being that you can only develop in a temple in Kyoto or in a Trappist monastery in the south of France. This is the path of an ordinary, shaky human being like you and I. That we all have this capacity to grow up fully if we help each other. And if we don't stop that arc of growing up fully, we begin to wake up to who and what we really are, and that makes us want to help other people. So we're back to our picture again. Of caring, of working, of maybe struggling, striving, but connected. The great a Jewish teacher and mystic, Martin Buber, who many of you have read in I and Thou, famously said, all real living is meeting. The same theme that we're focusing on this evening. All real living is meeting. And one of my teachers, Norman Fisher at the San Francisco Zen Center, said he was making the profound observation that when we truly meet one another, beyond our defenses, beyond our preconceptions, beyond our needs and desires, and that's a heck of a parenthetical piece, isn't it? Yeah. Without all of our defenses, without all of your psychological baggage, without all of your defenses, and beyond all of your preconceptions, all those lenses through which we look at each other. You know, a child is so innocent, they believe everything they see. You can play tricks on them. But as adults, we see what we believe because of this virtual reality that we're working with. Beyond our needs and desires, beyond this grasping and aversion that so shifts the way that we live our lives. If we can meet each other that way and open ourselves to each other with the courage to step toward one another, this approach capacity, then and only then can we be said to be completely alive. Real maturity is always meeting what's in front of you in this way. Real maturity is always meeting what's in front of you in this way. This is the function of spiritual practice, and this is the function of personal maturity. Although true maturity may be rare, we're all capable of it and can recognize it when we see it. When our lives are touched by a mature person, we feel it. We see it and notice it because we have limbic structures that help us orient to each other. We have prefrontal cortexes that help us resonate deeply with emotionality, not just data. And we have the capacity to go against the evolutionary grain and begin to see life as it really is instead of living in a virtual world. And when we do that, we cultivate a spacious heart and mind. We become a larger container for life to flow through us. We become that mind that is open and willing to learn, to listen, and that opens our heart. You know, the more we can see reality, when you look around, the more you see that people are having a hard time. I mean, if you really look. And if you don't turn away, and you keep looking more deeply, then your heart opens. If your heart opens and you don't turn away, then you can keep looking a little deeper. And wisdom and compassion begin to open together in the spacious heart and mind of spiritual practice. And that energy, that light, that capacity of an open heart and mind begins to illuminate the landscape of what's actually happening. We see the way things really are. And the way things really are is that life is an amazing challenge. It's kind of difficult. It's wonderful and amazing, but it's quite a challenge. And the only way we get through it is to have somebody by your side, really. And folks who don't suffer immensely. I mean, it sounds a little simplistic, but this is the way it goes. We need each other profoundly. And when we're able to open our hearts and minds, which illuminates the way things really are, then we begin to soften the barriers to loving and being loved. Then that capacity, the full capacity, the really unbound capacity of humanness can unfold. I asked my primary mentor, John Gladfelter, who I studied with for almost 40 years, who died in February. I asked him, I said, John, why is it that some people can use a relationship, like in talking psychotherapy, or a student-teacher relationship in the spiritual discipline? Why are some people able to use that and benefit from it and change, and some people don't seem to? And he said rather quickly and surprisingly, the capacity to experience gratitude. The capacity to experience gratitude. And I began to think, in order to experience gratitude, one has to be fairly mature. You know, immature love says, what can I get? What can you give me? What can I get? Mature love says, what can I offer? And as we become a resource for each other by opening our hearts and minds, seeing what's most true, softening our barriers to love, what we end up with is this immense gratitude for having a life at all. And to be able to serve each other and to be cared for in the simplest ways by the people that love us. And that's not a bad thing to wake up to. And that's not a bad thing to grow into. And those capacities are served by our minds and our nervous system, certainly. And also by what we sometimes call our heart. So I hope that this gives you an overview and kind of a picture of what's possible. And if you have questions, I'm happy to take them.